But then there's also the thing of we're not allowed to be angry.
Oh, yeah.
So where does that anger go?
I don't know.
That's a rhetorical question, you know.
In the bin.
Answer me, Kieran. Where does it go?
Yeah. Hello, and welcome back to Impolite Company. In this episode, we're going to be talking about mental health in the black community. We're going to ask the question, why do black men in the UK have higher rates of mental health issues than their white counterparts? We'll also talk about how racism could be playing a part in the developing mental health crisis in our community and access to support and help. It's a really interesting conversation that covers a lot from schooling to mistrust of medical institutions. Enjoy.
Hi.
Hello, how are
Hi,
you?
Kieran. Hi, everyone. How are you?
I'm good. It's been a interesting couple of months, which we'll talk about at some point, but I'm feeling much better.
Good.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah, we will talk about specifically why it's been a particularly weird and horrible few months. And I suppose that leads, in a way,
It does.
neatly into the topic that we're going to discuss today, which is mental health, and specifically mental health in the black community, and mine and Kieran's kind of perspectives on that, and also the kind of gendered differences in our experience on that.
Yeah, I think just in general, getting a little bit older, you start to reflect on these things. I'm like, why do I react that way? Or you think back to a time where you felt low. I'm definitely more aware of when I'm feeling lower, and the reason, and trying to analyze the reasons why. And a lot of that is from the past and experiences. And it's another thing that I have an exec coach who's amazing. Shout out to Robert. He's amazing. But it's another thing that we talk about, right? It's a part of everyone's identity, and nobody has 100% perfect mental health. It's not possible. Everyone goes through something at some point, but there are specific challenges, I think, for the black community. There's specific types of challenges that are shared, or if not more common.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Well, there are specific challenges that are the environmental factors in our lives impact our mental health. So, there's a statistic I was reading earlier that I thought was interesting, which is boys from African and Caribbean communities in the UK have lower levels of mental health problems at age 11 compared to white or mixed heritage boys. However, national health data shows that African and Caribbean men in the UK are much more likely to develop some type of mental health problem during adulthood. So schizophrenia, post-traumatic stress disorder. And this doesn't occur in countries with a predominantly black population.
Yeah. So you can't try and blame fucking genetics.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, I'm interested in your reaction to that stat.
It doesn't surprise me. The realization for me was reading Carla's book. He grew up in a very similar part of London than I did. So he grew up in Ladbroke Grove, and I was Shepherd's Bush. And some of his experiences at school, it's really interesting. I've talked about it in the podcast before. Like, how does that shape what happens, especially in kind of adulthood? And I think for me, as soon as I hear things like that, even though we're not seeing those things develop until adulthood, I think a lot of it is rooted in maybe some of the things that have happened when black men were children. So, like, for example, you said when they're younger at school, they tend to not have mental health issues.
It was they have lower rates of mental health issues in relation to the white population.
Yeah. And I wonder if part of that is that there isn't the structure and studies that are being done. Are they cared about as much to really understand? Does mental health show up in the same way? Is it the same types of things? Are we just measuring for specific things? But also, black, Caribbean and Pakistani boys are twice as likely to be excluded from school. Like, are they present for the studies? Because are there things that are happening which means they're not as present? Are they in detention? Could that be
what do you mean? Are you saying that they're not there to be surveyed?
Yeah, or is it, or from a community perspective, like, how are they doing this survey? Like, is it because their families are taking them to the doctors and that's when it's being recorded? But if the families aren't taking you there, it's not being recorded. It's the same thing around like the perception of intelligence as well. So one of the Small Axe episodes was about education, right? And one of the things that it talked about was when young black boys are younger, and then if they're not stimulated, what tends to happen is because they're bored, because they're not stimulated by the class, they tend to be top of the class at the beginning of school, and by the end of school, they're the bottom of the class. How the fuck does that happen? I think there's a series of things that happen leading up to adulthood. It might be within the education system, which is also the environment, but also cultural differences around mental health, which mean that you're more predisposed to potentially developing.
Yeah, I suppose when I read that stat, my immediate assumption or kind of hypothesis was, oh, the world happens to you in that space of time.
Yeah.
So when you're a child, you're like any other child.
Mm.
And the world happens to children quite quickly. Like children
Yeah.
experience racism quite quickly, for
Yeah.
instance. But the build up, the kind of collective build up
Compounds.
of societal issues and societal barriers and environmental issues and the experiences that young black boys go through when they reach teenage years and all of that stuff hasn't happened yet
Yeah.
when they're surveying 11-year-olds. But by the time you're an adult,
Yeah.
there are compounding issues of all of those things, plus, to your point, maybe some cultural stigma around how you express your mental health, how you seek help, how you reach out to your community when you're struggling.
Yeah. Well, when you're 11, you might not be able to articulate or fully understand what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it is happening when you're younger. One of the episodes I talked about the teacher that kind of threw the book in my friend's face. At the time, I didn't really have the knowledge to understand and connect all the dots of what was going on there. It's in hindsight that I'm like, oh my God, that was so messed up. I think at that age, if someone was to say, like, is racism playing out, I wouldn't have been able to have identified it because I didn't have...
Oh, it's definitely playing out.
Yeah.
It's just a question of when you're a 40-year-old man, you've been experiencing racism for 40 years.
Yeah.
When you're a 7-year-old kid, you've been experiencing it for comparatively less time and you have less understanding of it to be able to articulate what it is and what those things mean.
Yeah, there's an ignorance to it, isn't there? It's not compounded yet. You're not understanding how all those dots connect. It's not... You've only got a couple of paper cuts, not the 1,000 that you might get to. When I was growing up as well, this was like, early 90s? I think there was such a focus because of what my parents and grandparents had been through to just do well and not cause a scene or not cause too much trouble. There was almost that, like, just keep going. It's going to be hard. And I think a lot of people's parents had that conversation with them and said, it's going to be really fucking hard. And I was okay with that. It was just like, everyone had that conversation. But I think what happens is what also happens is when you get into adulthood, it's only words really until you get into the real world. And you're like, oh, this is really hard. Like I can study and be the top of the class. I can go to uni and get a first and work really hard and figure out how that all works. But when you go into the real world, it's slightly different.
That's true, but it's also your perspective as somebody who's quite academic. I think there's a lot of black boys and black girls. Well, there's a lot of black children that, what if you're not academic? What if you can't just shut up and apply yourself and get good grades and then kind of at least get your head down and kind of get out of there?
Yeah.
That's, I think, when you get into being labeled as disruptive, ending up on a suspension, ending up on expulsion. And we all know about the kind of expulsion to pupil referral unit to prison, pipeline. So I'm interested in how those things as well, those kinds of experiences must have such an impact on mental health, on self-worth, on how people view themselves and how people think about their own ambitions and all of that stuff.
Yeah, 100%. And especially if that's already starting to play out, if you aren't academic. And I wasn't massively academic. Like I was very much like middle of the class. Like I wasn't anything. I wouldn't say there's anything special in that. I'm saying that completely objectively. Like, it wasn't really until secondary school, and that was more because of the proximity to. It was a very mixed school that had different classes. There was a lot of things that happened, I think, that allowed me to, that helped me kind of explore my potential. But I did also, I think you're right in terms of, you know, if that started playing out from primary school and it doesn't get better in secondary school and it's just compounding and compounding, you come out of school, you may have the qualifications or you may not have the qualifications, but you go into the real world, the shock of that, and then the expectations. I think there's another angle as well. Is like when you don't see people that look like you in certain places, like this, it could feel very isolating.
Mm-hmm.
If you're like, shit, I haven't got the grades, and also when I'm looking at people that are in the field that I want to work in, and they also don't look at me, it's like, well, the world's against me. Like, what are the chances?
Yeah, yeah.
And I've spoken to, you know, I've spoken to friends that, and it's a class thing as well, but I've spoken to friends as well that have been had a completely different mindset and been like, well, I could never do that. I'm like, you're literally one of the most intelligent people I know, emotionally and like academically, and it's something that's just impacted how they feel about themselves and how they show up in the world.
Yeah, it's part of who we can imagine ourselves as. You've got to have a lot of imagination and a lot of determination and a lot of resilience to be able to say, even though I have grown up in a certain part of town, even though I have nobody around me who's in the kind of job I might want to do, even though when I look at those jobs, nobody in those jobs looks like me, even though all my teachers dislike me, I'm still going to somehow find a way to do that. And I think we're conned into thinking that's even possible because you have those kinds of, you know, in popular culture, you have those kinds of determination above all else, kinds of individualistic stories, you know.
Sanitized version of reality.
You have like pursuit of happiness kind of stories of like this one guy's determination to become a Wall Street stockbroker against all odds. You know, it's like the Oprah thing. Like if Oprah can do it, so can you. And so you have these kind of model minority myth type representations that make you think it must be a me problem if I can't, if these systems working against me succeed in holding me back.
The probability of getting to that, and if that story is being painted as though it's really easy, the fall from grace is insane. But how do you rebuild from that?
Yeah, and there's racism also tied up in the zones in which Black people are able to achieve excellence. It's like it's like running and singing.
Yeah, it's just bullshit.
It'd be good also to talk to you about, because you have these higher prevalence of mental health issues in people of Caribbean and African descent. That's also true in the US. You know, African Americans are 20% more likely to experience serious psychological distress and major depressive disorders than white Americans. But then you also have the institutional situation and issue in which there's a kind of deep distrust in my experience of kind of medical institutions in the Black community. And
authority in general, right?
Authority in general, and institutions in general.
Yeah.
And certainly medical institutions, you know. I've had long conversations with my grandma about vaccinations, and I coached a woman for a while, a Black woman, who we did a lot of kind of deep personal work, and I had to be really boundaried about making sure it didn't step into a therapeutic zone in which I wasn't qualified to guide her. And so we had a lot of conversations about initiating therapy, and her resistance was so strong. And when we unpacked a lot of that resistance, it was around being pathologized. It was around quite extreme like fears of, if I open up to this person, are they going to section me? What right would they have to, you know, there was a real deep kind of fear around discussing mental health with any form of medical professional, with any form of kind of medical institution. And it took a really long time of kind of continual talking about it to get her to even explore it, to even kind of take the first steps in it.
Yeah. How much of that is through like generational trauma because of past events? Like in terms of like it being passed down that you don't trust because of certain events that happen. I can't remember what the study was in the US. Had a massive knock-on effect for African Americans and their trust.
Are you talking about the syphilis study?
Yes.
Where they just let guys get syphilis?
Yeah.
And like watched it play out over the course of multiple decades while they just went blind.
Yeah.
And it was like an experiment and they weren't told.
And the reward was that they got healthcare, right? And all they thought they were signing up was to do a safe experiment and they would get medical insurance as a reward for that.
Yeah.
Not that they would like, that they knew that.
And they knew they had syphilis and they were letting the syphilis ravage their bodies. And, you know, the cure for syphilis is like penicillin. It's like really easy to cure.
Yeah.
But yes, and that was the US government.
Yeah. So I wonder
I think it was the CDC that was carrying that out.
I wonder what part of, and then there's like a massive whistleblower that blew it all up. But
they've apologized, so we just all shut up about it now.
Yeah, exactly. but I just wonder what you think about how much that plays a part in. Even I think I'm not sure whether people can articulate why they don't trust. Like for example, in America, they don't trust the medical system. They know why, or have they inherited things? Have they had personal experiences, and then it's compounded by the things that they've inherited?
I think it's and both. The history of so much medical stuff, like that study is a great example. You know, gynecology. Do you know the origin of gynecology is that they would operate on enslaved black women without anesthesia. And that's the origin of gynecology, right? Of just like poking around and experimenting with enslaved black women's vaginas, basically. So that's deep generational trauma.
Yeah.
And, you know, we know from things like epigenetics that we hold that trauma, you know, in our bodies.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, I think we've got very present, current reasons not to trust. I was looking into some of this, and I was reading something from 2021 that said black people are more than 4 times more likely to be the subject of restrictive interventions, so being restrained, being sectioned, being held in isolation. Yeah. And so those are kind of real world, present day examples.
And even the language used is different, right? My sister has worked with lots of young, she's a caseworker, and that was one of the things that was a massive surprise to her, and she saw it playing out, right? Like when there was a black young man having a mental break, they were dealt with very differently, and terms used were very different.
Yes. Yeah.
To describe exactly the same behaviours.
Yeah. And so I think there is a real fear of a real kind of present fear and a real present danger that once you start interacting with institutions, there's no way out. That applies to medical institutions. I think that applies to like the prison system. That applies to so many like institutions in society. I think black people feel as though once I interact with that thing, I'm in the cycle of interacting with it, and it's very hard to break away from it. So I'm not going to even remotely go there. And there's that whole thing of like, black people don't call the police, right? Yeah. You'd never call the police on a black person, like pretty much ever. Yeah. And I think a similar thing, I've seen and experienced some quite extreme mental health breaks with people. And I would never unless there was such a real and present danger that they were going to harm themselves or harm other people, all of my instincts would be that I wouldn't call and try and get them sectioned or get that, it would just go against all my instincts.
You could make it worse. Yeah.
But in a way that the same kind of thing wouldn't run through my mind if they were white, I don't think. I would inherently trust the institutions more from the lens of that being a white person.
I've never thought about that scenario as you're saying it. I'm like, it makes sense what you're saying. If one of my black friends had a mental health break, what would I do?
You might call 111. You might you might engage in those
I just don't know
services,
yeah.
but that kind of there is that reticence.
Yeah.
To be like, what's going to happen?
Yeah.
If they have to be restrained in some way.
Yeah.
So I do think that's a real and kind of present fear.
Yeah. I guess my question as well to you would be, I'm saying this as a black man, I think there's an element also of like, when we talk about masculinity for black men, I think you're expected even more so to be a man's man, to not have feelings. Some of that is bullshit from history, right? Like, stripping you of any emotion and personality,
and the black man is fetishized in a kind of hyper masculine way.
Yeah.
On the scale of masculinity.
Yeah.
The kind of trope in a way is that the hyper masculine end of that spectrum is a black man.
Yeah.
So it's almost like, well, I don't know if that's been your experience, but it feels to me as though it's like multiplied. The kind of the expectations that fall on men in terms of mental health, in terms of being strong, in terms of not kind of showing emotion, are amplified.
Yeah. I think when I was younger, I definitely was more disconnected with my emotions. I think my friends would even say now that I'm the most stable one, but that's just external. That's what people's perceptions of me are. When I say stable, as in like the way that I feel things, and we've talked about this before, about I'm a very empathic person. Mm-hmm. I do feel things really quite heavily, but I've learned how to just, I think, and not like I've tried to learn it, it's just an expectation that, I used to cry a lot as a child. I don't cry as much now. I probably cry more now that I'm getting older. But there was a period where I think I was just quite stoic about everything. Like I didn't.
And to what extent do you feel that you had to be?
I definitely think, looking back, it was just an expectation. People would see you come into a room and they would expect you to be a certain way. And I've had people say that to me once they've got to know me and I felt comfortable with them. They're like, you're completely different to what I expected.
Oh, I've got that. Yeah. I've got that old chestnut.
Yeah. And I think that's all to do with that, right? That's their stereotyping expectations of you. They see, I thought you were going to be like really strict. Why?
Yeah. I thought you were scary before I really got to know you.
Like, that's actually
I've had that one at work multiple times.
Yeah.
You're actually really nice.
Like, why is that a surprise? You're a bitch. You've actually turned out to be horrible.
And it's like, it's both true that they're stereotyping, and it's also true that I think I have had to embody a scariness at work, quote unquote, at work in order to get by. Yeah. There's also a softness that I am not as able to display. There's also a kind of tough exterior that I've had to, as a for instance, when you're a woman of color who is managing a team which consists of some young, misogynistic, racist men, you have to learn where to find your tough side, and that's true of lots of managers, but it's kind of especially true. And it's especially true that you're going to be undermined, and it's especially true that people are going to try and walk all over you, and they're going to try and push the boundaries, and they're going to try and steal your work. And so you do start to build up these layers of hardness, stoicism. Yeah. And so then it's like you get to that point and then people go, oh, you're scary. And you're like, I've kind of had to be pretty fucking ferocious because I've had to be. Yeah. I'm not able to be my fully authentic self. And then there was one guy who's a really quite senior guy who joined. We used to do 360 feedback in our reviews, and he said something like that. He said something like I was really hard to read or something. He said something really vague and not helpful. And it was like, you're really hard to read, and I feel like you're not always just saying what you think about things. You're kind of calculating what to say. It was something weird like that.
So
and
you're
I was like,
so you're basically like calculating, and I can't trust you.
Yeah. And I was like, I can't just be like, in head comes out of mouth like you can. That's not how it works for me, I'm afraid.
I can't just say whatever I think that comes out of comes to the top of my. I mean, I do sometimes, but it still goes through a process.
So there's almost this kind of cyclical compounding thing, which is people expect you to be a certain way, you then end up being more that way because you have to be or you have to get by, which kind of furthers that
Yeah.
perception of you.
I got bullied for not being black enough.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, what is black? Black isn't a certain way, but it was stereotyped to be a certain way.
But
So
we oppress ourselves in those ways because we get put in boxes, and then we're like, that's the only box. You know,
yeah,
how many black kids feel comfortable being into like rock
yeah,
or being emo
yeah.
or being kind of geeky or being, you know, it's like and it feels like some kind of betrayal to be anything but what is seen as black. I can see how it could almost be seen as a bit of a betrayal that you're into types of music that white people like as well. And so in some ways maybe it could be said that you're trying to assimilate with white people. Not, and so you don't have the luxury of just liking what you like.
No.
There's always kind of some kind of
and there may have
meaning.
been a level of assimilation as well. Like we're kids, right? Like people are trying to figure out who they are. You're assimilating maybe to the version of blackness that you're supposed to be. It may not be how you've been brought up.
Oh yeah, of course.
You know what I mean? And I think that's what's really interesting is like in that environment, we're all playing to the rules that have been created for us rather than like the reality. And I just think, so if we go back to like what we're talking about around like black men's health, you know, we can kind of look at it and talk about it. And I think probably even at the time when we were younger, we were assessing what was going on. We were taking it in and looking at it in some way. Or if you don't have the ability to do that, I think I had a lot of support from around me, not only from my friends, but my parents. If you don't have any guidance, you're just left to deal with that. It's really complicated. Like even I was thinking about something the other day, and I was like, no, I'm just going to do it and see what happens. And it was fine, but it was what was expected. But there was still felt really scary to do it. I've got something in me, but I think when I was younger, it was much scarier. And I think if you aren't able to overcome that, or you don't have the tools, or you're not in the environment that's going to allow you to feel safe to make mistakes, for example.
I think there's definitely an internalized, unable to make mistakes thing. Certainly in the Caribbean community, I think failure feels like not an option.
Yeah.
And to the extent that mental health is involved, I think there is a stigma. This is broadly the case in general, as you know, this is the case outside of the black community as well, but there's definitely a heavy stigma of having mental health issues or dips is potentially seen as a failure.
Yeah. It's pride. We deal with it internally or with a small group. We don't show any sign of weakness. Like I know there's probably things that my granddad should have got professional help with, but it was kept. You know, they were already dealing with enough being, you know, a mixed family. Let's not acknowledge there's other problems, even though we know there is. It wasn't the done thing, right? It wasn't there was no one coming to your family going, we know this is a problem in the community, and someone from your community.
Well, that's another kind of question, because I think if with the mistrust of institutions that have systemic racism within them, you then think, well, you know, what community-based interventions are there, and would there be more? Perhaps, if I sometimes wonder, would my grandma have been more upheld and kind of lifted up by the community had she been in Jamaica than in Leeds in the 60s, raising 3 kids? What was the support system like there, and how did that impact her mental health?
Big Caribbean community in Leeds, right?
It was sort of one of those cities that Windrush generation people went to.
Wherever there was factories.
But not necessarily as much as like London or Birmingham, I don't think.
Yeah. And I think and community is a big thing, isn't it? It's a big thing. Like when in London, there was obviously more of a community in London. There's I've talked about this as well before. There was a really big community centre that my mum worked in. I think that created an environment where you did have that community. All those things are gone now. Like, and even things like play centres from when I was younger in London, they're gone. Mm-hmm. And there were a lot of young boys of colour that went to those things and got to experience things that they wouldn't have experienced at school or at home. They got to see. I remember a lot of the play workers would be quite diverse, and you got to see people in authority. Like I remember the woman that was at my play centre that I went to, she was like a headmistress, but for the play centre. That's the way I saw it as a child. I was like, I'd never seen, I think she was mixed race, I'm not sure, but I'd just never seen a black woman in authority like that.
Mm-hmm.
At that age, it was like a thing that
Mm-hmm.
I got to see. I didn't see that in school. I don't think I had any black teachers at school. And that's in the middle of London, Zone 2. So like, but those things are gone. The government over the last 12 years have like genuinely just devastated those things. And kind of when you think about what environment that creates, especially for people like my mum, who was essentially a single mother when I was a lot younger, she was able to work and continue supporting a family and pursuing a career that we all benefited from because she had childcare in these subsidised play centres that would look after me and give me access to lots of different things. But it means I wasn't on the streets doing all sorts, which I probably would have been if we didn't have that, or I would have been, I don't know, maybe I probably would have been in a childminder or whatever. But at the same time, all of that was subsidised. It's not really now. So you can imagine what happens to young boys that don't have that support in those hours, especially if they come from a single parent household. All that stuff over time, what you said, is compounding. What are they also experiencing? What are they going out and doing? I think I played out a couple of times, and every time there was a fuckery. Every single time. And my mum was like, "You're not going out anymore." And I'm not a troublemaker, but I got myself into trouble just by going out, just playing out.
Yeah.
You can't blame it on the parents.
No, there's a very specific socioeconomic reason why that's happening, and these are like political decisions. Often you strip these things away so that people don't have outlets, and so that the class divide gets worse, right? Because you have less working class kids going into the arts, you have less working class kids with avenues for their skills and their passions and all that kind of stuff, and then you get people being criminalized, and then it feeds that narrative that black people, working class people, and there's a lot of crossover on that Venn diagram, right, are inherently criminal in some way. And it's like, no, there's a direct line between services and access to services.
We've seen knife crime rise as subsidized services were starting to be taken out. There's a direct correlation to knife crime going up.
But I think people know that, and I think that it's a political. Sorry, when I say people, I mean, Margaret Thatcher.
Politicians know that.
They know that, but they want to make their culture war case, and it's easy to make the culture war case if you can demonize, if you can criminalize, if you can, do all of that stuff. It'd be good also to talk about your view on to what extent can we view mental health on an individual level. So individual people trying to grapple with their mental health and accessing services or not accessing services or getting help or whatever. That's one part of the question, I think, and why different people from different communities find that so much harder. And then there's the question, I think, of can you even discuss mental health on that kind of individual level when we know that we're so impacted by the kind of societal, by the systemic. So there's some research also on black people experiencing racism and experiencing trauma even secondhand. So by that I mean by seeing it on social media. That leads to PTSD like symptoms. So, in the context of the last decade really, but the last 3 years or so in particular, the amount of murder and violence enacted on black bodies that we have seen, like physically seen, like comes up without warning on your social media. You can watch a black guy die in the street, right? Like, what does that do? And how does that add to what we're talking about? And to what extent can we even get help on an individual level when those things are still there?
Yeah, so I'm trying not to get too emotional.
Yeah. Well, you don't have to.
I think BLM was for me, there was a massive wall that I hit. When you're not only are you unpacking a lot of stuff when you're seeing things like that. I remember there was a point where I was like, it's too much.
Yeah. It's too much. It is too much. I've not actually. I mean, some is unavoidable.
Yeah.
I've deliberately not watched those videos, any of those videos.
Yeah.
I've not watched Eric Garner. I've not watched George Floyd. I've not watched any of those videos.
I've only watched the George Floyd one, and I was like,
I can't.
I didn't know what I think, and I think that's part of the thing, right? It hit me like a ton of bricks, because when you see it playing out, you're like, this is so fundamentally fucked up. It's hard to articulate the feelings that you feel in that, like that it could be if you were in the wrong place in the wrong time. People say, well, you know, you're not in America or you're not whatever. It's like, it doesn't matter. If I go and visit America, like there is we are close. We have close proximity to that.
We won't go on family holidays to America now.
Yeah, I didn't while Trump. No, I'm not
post 2016. Yeah,
we had a holiday already booked from. We were meant to go the year that the pandemic hit, so we went on that holiday. But I think I might have to go for work now and then. But I hated the way it felt there. I went to Florida, and I could feel it was completely different to the last time I've been there. Like, the country is divided. We spoke to our friends. We've got family friends there. They said the same thing. But I think going back to your question about, and I got a little bit emotional there, but I think going back to your question is that definitely plays a part. And if you don't have the resilience, and you don't have the well, it breaks down your resilience. It chips away at it.
Well, do you even think there's some... Well, I almost even think that it cuts through the resilience question in a way of like, this is hard to articulate, and I don't know whether or not the white listeners that we've got will relate to this or not. Perhaps if they're Jewish, you know, when I've spoken to Jewish friends who are descended from Holocaust survivors and that kind of thing, that's the one of the only times I've experienced the kind of the empathy, the level of kind of sharing of when I see someone from my community being hurt, it feels like a punch in the gut. It's like that, seeing human beings in pain, but there's something quite specific about seeing a violent racist attack on somebody who looks like you, who could be your brother, who could be, combined with that kind of epigenetic thing that we talked about of like the trauma we're just holding. It feels like it kind of twists something inside you that is almost hard to articulate, that is generational, that isn't just about this life, it's about the lives before. It's about... It engages something on an emotional level that I think probably goes back to the past 250 years. Like, I know, and you know, that the fact that our origins are Caribbean means we're descended from enslaved people. Full stop. We're not indigenous to that part of the world. And that means we know, whether we've done our ancestry or not, that there is so much deep pain in our lineage.
Well, when you just think, sorry to interrupt, but even when you just think about, when you look at our genetics, the reason why you can tell someone's from the Caribbean rather than from the African continent is because we have European genes, because rape was rife. For hundreds of years, probably every black female slave may have been raped at some point. Like, that is deep. Just that alone is deep trauma that will continue for I don't know how long. Like, that's just one thing, right? I mean, you think about that being so widespread and that showing up in our genetics as well. We will carry a lot of that trauma.
Yes. And then, you know, I think there's an interesting thing as well about, or question about, the secondhand experience of witnessing violence. Not only what it does to us, but also the kind of almost voyeurism of it. You know, someone in something I read made a really good point of when there's there have been shootings, for instance, in America, in which white people have been killed that have been on video, but you basically don't see the video, and so there's a respect that is for want of a better word, there's a respect that is given to white victims, which is we don't watch that.
Yeah.
We don't disseminate that.
Yeah.
We don't because you don't want to see your aunt being gunned down on the TV or like as you're scrolling through your Instagram.
Yeah.
And there's something about the disrespect, even in death, to black people that we're like used to seeing it, that like it's kind of normal to see it. Like when I see a photo of a black guy with his shoulders in, looking at the camera, like a school picture or a graduating picture, I immediately, if that comes up on the news, I think he's died. That's my immediate response is to go, is to scan the article and see if if this is about somebody being killed. That's so instinctive in my response. I worry about how much of that is consumed, and I get the awareness thing. I get that, like when Philando Castile was killed, it was live streamed, and his girlfriend was live streaming it because there's a thing that happens now of like the truth. The police won't tell the truth, and the body cam footage won't be on, and there's a real the power in that footage, and at the same time, what it does to us to see it.
Yeah. Do you think we know the damage it's doing?
No.
I don't think we do. Like, I think sometimes things like that, like today, catch me by surprise.
If I see a picture of Trayvon Martin, I immediately cry.
Oh, wow.
That's been the case since he was killed, I think, 9 years ago now, nearly a decade ago.
Yeah.
If I see a picture of that boy, I cry. If it comes up that it's the anniversary, or it's his birthday, or something comes up on social media, it doesn't even have to be an image that is in and of itself a trigger warning type of image. It sets me off.
I get more angry about Stephen Lawrence. I just get angry.
Well, yeah.
And that's another emotion tied to that trauma of like.
But then there's also the thing of we're not allowed to be angry.
Oh, yeah.
So where does that anger go?
I don't know.
That's a rhetorical question, In
the bin.
Answer me, Kieran. Where does it go?
Yeah. How does it get dealt with? I do think, so for me, for example, when we talked about the end of the last season, talked about doing the podcast being very cathartic. This is one way of releasing that, I think, for me. But I don't know if as a community or of people, we invest enough in doing things that help release some of the bullshit that we.
Well, do you think that that's why? I was thinking as I was doing the research for this episode about that play that we went to see.
Yeah.
So the play is called For Black Boys Who Have Considered Suicide When the Hue Gets Too Heavy. And Kieran and I went to this theatre show. It did a limited run.
Better be coming back. I want to say again.
In the past kind of 6 months or so.
And
a group of us went. And it was the most remarkable play I've ever seen, I think. And quite a few people, we were a group of about 10 of us went, and quite a few people were kind of, when you watch a film and you kind of can't review it afterwards because nobody has anything to say.
Yeah.
Everyone's kind of still stunned.
We were like, bye. Went home.
Yeah. What did you think of that? And my friend Andrea, who is famously unimpressed by things, was clearly so moved. It is a black guy as well. Is a black gay man, and there's some intersectional exploration of both of those things in the play. Was like, he said something to me like, I've never seen something that I've related to.
Yeah, it was mad.
More. And part of the reason I'm bringing it up, the kind of basic premise of the show, or the basic structure of the scene is that you have a group of young black men in a kind of group therapy context talking about their individual experiences of being black, and they've got quite different experiences and they're explored in different ways, and there's a kind of group dynamic, and it's hard to explain play. But part of what I thought was remarkable about it was seeing that kind of raw empathy and that complexity of portrayal of black men in that kind of context, especially in the theatre.
Yeah.
You know, in the West End.
Do you know what I also thought was like quite profound was the understanding and discourse that happened between a group of very different young black men, how they supported each other, but also for me the most surprising thing was I've never heard a lot of those stories spoken out loud, coming out of a black man's mouth. I'd never associated those experiences apart from the ones I could relate to, which I related to a lot of them, but I'd never heard it spoken out loud in an open environment. You just don't see black men
with that vulnerability and complexity.
And support with each other.
It's like how, I don't know if you've ever seen Moonlight.
No, I haven't seen that yet. Why have I not seen
Another
that yet?
film that Andrea didn't like.
Oh, really? Why didn't you like it, Andrea? This is a question for you.
Direct question.
You can send a message in the Spotify app.
He's going to listen to this episode and be like, what the fuck, Ella?
We can call it Why Didn't You Like It, Andrea?
We should get him on for a pop culture episode.
Oh, I'd love that.
He works in the arts and he has very good taste. But one of the things about Moonlight, which isn't a spoiler, is about a black boy and it's like a coming of age story. He's about a gay black boy. And there's a scene in which he kisses another black man. And I went to see it at the cinema, and I remember saying to my partner at the time, I've never seen that before.
Yeah.
And I hadn't realized I hadn't seen it until I saw it. And then I was like, whoa.
Oh, yeah.
I have never seen that before. I'd watched Queer as Folk with my mum, and I'd had a gay education.
Yeah.
But I was like, why have I never seen this before?
Yeah. Why does it feel...
And he was one of the characters was quite hyper masculine.
Yeah.
And I was like, I have never seen two men like this kiss who are black, who are like, and, you know, I think that film came out about 7 years ago now. Yeah. It's nuts that we don't have these cultural touch points that explore that kind of complexity.
Yeah. It's the same with, and not the same level of complexity, but it's the same with, I remember having that feeling when I watched Dreamgirls, the musical.
Oh, yeah.
And that sounds like really, like now, but think about, that was a huge film with a fully black cast that did, I think it was the highest grossing film.
You're forgetting The Wiz.
Sorry, excuse me.
1970s trailblazing The Wiz.
I just remember the scene with, and the interaction between Effie and I can't remember the name of the
Beyonce character.
Jamie
No,
Foxx.
sorry, yeah.
The love there and the betrayal, but then also the fact, like, just all these things that I'd not seen on the big screen.
Mm-hmm.
But I felt exactly the same with like when Black Panther was introduced into the cinematic universe, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, when he was in Civil War. And it was when he first came up, when he took the mask off, even though I knew he was black, when he took that mask off, I got goosebumps. Because I'd never seen
a black superhero,
apart from Storm, which they massively watered down. They messed that character up in the original X.
Yeah.
And they made her a plot device, and she pushed in the last ones to have more lines and be more like substantial.
I also thought Storm was darker in the comics.
Yeah, she was.
I'm not a comic book nerd, so correct me.
She was darker,
but she was darker skinned, and like I love Halle Berry, but
yeah, she's
a palatable black woman.
Yeah, exactly. Especially at the time, she was the palatable black woman of choice for superhero movies. Remember, she was the Catwoman.
She was a Bond girl.
Yeah.
You know, she had the crossover appeal.
I mean, yeah. But when he took them, I remember that, and it's not as deep as, you know, seeing two black men kissing on screen for the first time, but someone that is really who has been in an environment that is just predominantly white men as superheroes, suddenly having this black superhero that came in and like essentially fucked things up for the right reasons, in terms of not in a way just like it was just violence, but he was articulate, he was a king, he was actually a prince when he first came into it. Like, it had a massive impact. It was like, I knew he was going to be in the film, but it's still, when you see it, there's that why is the other thing. It's like, why does it have that impact? Why is it like that? And we know why, but I think you know what I mean.
Because it's so scarce, and also I think you don't realize you're living in a desert until you get a drop of water, and you're like, ah.
Yeah. And I mean, Black Panther as a character, like as a superhero, is not perfect. The messaging isn't great.
No, but that's another thing that you want more representation of, like imperfect characters and human characters, and all of that kind of stuff. I think that we've spoken about representation before, but that you don't realize how much that lack of exploration of those different kind of complexities impact your own personal, how you self-identify and how you think about yourself and how you engage with your own mental health. And
exactly. And it makes you think about that, right? It makes you go away and go, why did I react that way?
Oh yeah. I think we have so much ingrained hypervigilance about so much, which is, generationally has served a purpose. It's kept us safe. In an environment where you can get lynched for walking on the wrong side of the street, hypervigilance is a survival mechanism.
Yeah.
But now you have this like legacy of hypervigilance, and I think we're learning to try and shed some of those things.
Yeah.
And yet you still have society pushing back, and you have government pushing back, and you have ingrained systemic racism in systems. We've not even spoken about things like the black, maternity mortality rates and black women's pain not being taken seriously, all of those things. And so it's really hard to then on an individual level do the work to try and overcome those things.
Yeah, it's so true. Hopefully we've talked about a lot of the things that we can talk about from not only studies but also from our own experiences of why that could be, and why it isn't easy to be successful or to overcome some of those things, because there's things that are out of your control. There's things that are
and I almost reject the concept of individuals overcoming these societal issues. It's like the issues need to be addressed at the societal level, not at the individual level.
And also, being black, you are not allowed to make as many mistakes.
Yeah.
So actually the stakes are higher, right? Like, you make one mistake. I can't remember I think it was about English black comedians. It was Richard Blackwood and a few other black comedians, and they were saying, you get a special, and this was like in the 90s, you make one mistake, you're out. If you were a white male comedian, you could have 3 or 4 flops and you'd still be. So the stakes are higher. We want to be perfect.
Yeah. It's not just that we have a fear of failure, it's that the world doesn't allow us to fail. As is often the case, we probably feel like we have more to talk about. But I really enjoyed that conversation. I think it meandered in lots of interesting directions. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.